Alright, so my book is The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. That's my name, that's the title of the book. So to give a brief summary, it's a story about this proper English gentleman butler who served this lord during World War II, and now he's working for this other Mr. Faraday character, and Mr. Faraday's telling him he's too uptight, he needs to learn how to chat, have a good time, and he suggests that in order to do this, he should go on vacation. So the story is about the butler, who's named Stevens, getting on a train and traveling the English countryside, having flashbacks and reminiscing. He's going to go visit his old woman friend from the Lord Darlington's estate, which is where he originally worked, Miss Kenton. So, Kazuo Ishiguro won the Nobel Prize, and during his interview, he mainly talked about how he was glad to be a positive force for good in the world, and how literature had power to do both good and evil. But one of the most particularly shocking parts of his interview is where he talked about there's two worlds that everyone lived in. The inner world, which is your inner desires, your secret thoughts, who you are as a person, and the outer world, which is the pressures of society and the impacts of everyone else. And at its core, the book is about lies and trying to reconcile these two worlds in a way. So the reconciliation of the two worlds, your personal desires sometimes conflict with the outside world, and at its core, this book, The Remains of the Day, if you just look at it from a general perspective, it seems like a boring book about an English butler traveling the countryside, and in a way it is, but the inner conflict that he faces is the main focus of the novel, and it's him trying to reconcile who he is as a person with what the world expects of him as a proper English butler. So this mirrors our day-to-day society about how we tell lies to maintain the balance between those two worlds, because if you believe something that's different than the common flow, most people are just going to lie to keep the peace. For example, 60% of people lie 2 to 3 times in a 10-minute conversation, according to Psychology Today. So that just shows how commonplace it is to lie to keep these two worlds separate but still in harmony with one another. Also, only 30% of people on dating websites and the internet say they're actually honest with their photos and with their bios. So obviously people lie every day in their life, and this book kind of explores the reasons why they do that. So this is Stevens, the proper English butler, who's played by Anthony Hopkins in the movie. So he kind of symbolizes what happens if you let the outer world completely take over who you are as a person. So Stevens kind of always bowed to societal expectations. Everyone expected him to be the proper butler, always be perfect, prim, capable, and that's what he became. For example, one particular shocking moment, he's serving his Lord Darlington, and his father's dying upstairs in the room, and he finds out that he dies, and he doesn't even go to see his dying father. He just simply sheds a tear, wipes it away, and goes and carries out some tea to the company. So he always put Lord Darlington in societal expectations of him before himself. So Mr. Darlington, Lord Darlington, was Stevens' boss, and he wasn't the best. He was a pretty bad guy. He was anti-Semitic, and that was one of the key conflicts that Stevens had. So Mr. Darlington ordered Stevens to fire all the Jewish housekeepers and servants, and Stevens internally thought that this was a reprehensible thing to do and was very against the idea, but due to the societal expectation of him to always serve his master without question, without thought, to be a good butler, he went ahead and did it anyways, regardless of the consequences to himself and to the housekeepers, obviously. So Mr. Darlington kind of symbolized in the novel the pressures of the outside world against Stevens, who was the person. So regardless of what Stevens thought about society and the impact, he always went along with it. He was too afraid to stand up for his inner self and instead to bow to outside pressures every time. So the key theme of the book was how you needed to learn how to balance the outer pressures and the inner self, because Stevens kind of let himself be trod over. He had a really sad life when you think about it. He let one of the only people who ever cared about him, his father, die upstairs in a room while he was serving a Nazi lord who didn't really even care about him. He kind of sacrificed of himself every time and never cared about his inner world and just let the outer pressures always take over. And this is seen when later in the book he's talking to another butler while waiting for a train, and they're talking about their lives, and Stephen starts to break down and cry, thinking about how his life has been a waste and about how he served bad people. But then in the end he composes himself and says, oh well, I'll be a good servant to Mr. Faraday, his new leader. So instead of really having a paradigm shift, he kind of continues just doing the same thing except with a new master. So, which also symbolizes society. Society may have changed, but he's still just a slave to it instead of listening to his own personal desires. So that's all I got.
Yeah.